The Friday night rush at the Velvet Spoon was something she had learned to survive rather than enjoy. The air inside the restaurant was thick, a heavy mix of expensive perfume, sizzling garlic butter, and the sharp, acidic tang of anxiety that always seemed to hang over the staff when the dining room was full. She moved through the tightly packed tables like a ghost, her eyes fixed on the floor or the notepad in her hand, trying her best to be invisible. At 28 years old, she felt much older, her feet throbbing inside her non-slip shoes and a dull ache settling permanently into her lower back. To the wealthy patrons sitting in the velvet booths, she was just a waitress. A faceless server who brought their linguine, refilled their wine glasses, and politely ignored their rude comments about the service being too slow. They saw the stained black apron tied around her waist and the tiredness in her eyes, but they never saw the person underneath. They certainly never saw the artist. She carried a heavy tray loaded with dirty dishes back toward the kitchen, dodging a busboy who wasn't looking where he was going. The kitchen was a war zone of shouting chefs, clanging metal, and hissing grills, but she found a strange sort of comfort in the noise. It was loud enough to drown out her own thoughts. As she stacked the plates in the bin, she caught her reflection in the shiny metal surface of the refrigerator door for a brief second. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back too tight in a ponytail, and a smear of tomato sauce decorated her cheek like a badge of dishonor. She wiped it away quickly and checked the clock on the wall. Only 3 more hours until closing. Walking back out onto the floor, the atmosphere was different. The clatter was softer here, replaced by the low hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. But her eyes were immediately drawn, as they always were, to the far corner of the room. Standing there, bathed in a soft, golden light from a vintage floor lamp, was a beautiful baby grand piano. It was polished to a high gloss, looking elegant and out of place among the chaotic dining tables. It was the centerpiece of the restaurant, yet it was almost always silent. The owner, a man who cared more about profit than art, only hired a pianist for Saturday nights. On Fridays, it just sat there. A prop. A decoration for people to rest their coats on. She felt a familiar tug in her chest as she walked past it to clear table 4. It was a physical sensation, like a hook pulling at her ribs. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. She remembered the weight of keys, the resistance of the hammers, and the vibration that would travel up her arms when she really played. She remembered a time when her hands were used to create beauty, not just to scrape food off plates. Years ago, before the bills piled up and life got in the way, she had been someone else entirely. She had been a prodigy. She could still vividly recall the smell of the practice rooms at the conservatory, dust, old wood, and the faint scent of rosin. She remembered the feeling of sitting on a stiff bench for hours, her fingers dancing over the ivory until they bled, chasing a perfect sound that always seemed just out of reach. Back then, the world had been wide open. Her teachers had told her she was destined for concert halls, for grand stages, for a life filled with music. But destiny, she had learned, was expensive. When her father got sick and the medical bills started arriving, reality had crashed down hard. The scholarship covered tuition, but it didn't cover rent or medicine or the cost of keeping the lights on. She had to make a choice. She could stay in school, buried in debt and guilt, or she could drop out, get a job, and make sure her family survived. She chose her family. It was the right thing to do, she told herself every single day, but it didn't make the sacrifice hurt any less. She stopped at table 7, forcing a bright smile onto her face as an older couple waved her down. "More water, please," the man said without looking at her. She nodded and hurried away, the smile vanishing the moment she turned her back. She felt a sudden, sharp wave of resentment. It wasn't fair. She knew she was talented. She knew she had something inside her that most people only dreamed of having, yet here she was, fetching water for people who didn't even know her name. She passed the piano again on her way to the water station. This time, she stopped for just a fraction of a second. She reached out, her hand hovering over the fall board. The keys were right there. They were dusty, neglected, just waiting to be touched. For a second, she imagined what would happen if she just sat down. If she lifted the lid and let her fingers find the opening chords of the Rachmaninoff piece she had been practicing in her head for 10 years. Would anyone stop her? Would anyone even listen? Fear stopped her hand. It had been years since she had played seriously. Her fingers were stiff now, calloused from heavy lifting and scrubbing. The music in her head was perfect, but she was terrified that her hands would betray her. What if she sat down and nothing came out? What if the magic was gone? The fear of being mediocre was worse than the pain of being invisible. She pulled her hand back and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, turning away quickly before the manager could see her loitering. The shift wore on, the minutes dragging like hours. Her body moved on autopilot, taking orders, delivering food, processing payments. But her mind was elsewhere, drifting through memories of recitals and applause. She thought about the dusty electric keyboard sitting in the corner of her small, lonely apartment. She hadn't turned it on in months. It was too painful to look at. It was like seeing an old friend she had abandoned. Every time she walked past it, it reminded her of the life she had lost, the potential she had wasted. By the time the restaurant started to empty out, she was physically drained. Her feet felt like lead weights, and her uniform clung to her skin with sweat. The Friday night crowd was thinning, leaving behind a mess of half-eaten food and crumpled napkins. She began the slow process of wiping down tables, resetting the cutlery, and sweeping the floors. The music from the kitchen radio had stopped, and the restaurant was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerators. She found herself standing in front of the piano again. The dining room was nearly empty now. The last few customers were paying at the register. The golden light from the floor lamp flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the glossy black surface. It looked lonely. It looked the way she felt. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. The manager was in his office counting the cash drawer, and the other servers were out back taking a smoke break. She was alone. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached out and ran a single finger along the cold, smooth wood of the piano's lid. It felt familiar. It felt like coming home. The silence in the room was heavy, pressing against her ears, waiting to be broken. She took a deep breath, her heart beating a little faster. She knew she shouldn't. She knew she had to go home and sleep so she could do it all over again tomorrow. But looking at those 88 black and white keys, she realized just how much she missed the music. She missed the way it made her feel alive, important, seen. With a shaky breath, she pulled out the bench. It squeaked slightly against the floor, a loud sound in the quiet room. She sat down, the fabric of her work pants stretching uncomfortably. She felt small on the bench, overwhelmed by the size of the instrument. She placed her hands on her knees, staring at the keys. They were dusty, just as she had suspected, but to her, they were beautiful. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the silence, letting the memories of the conservatory wash over her. She wasn't a waitress here. She wasn't a debt-ridden daughter. She was just a musician, and the piano was waiting. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change. But for now, in that quiet, empty restaurant, she was just a tired woman sitting at a piano, wondering if she still remembered how to play. The night was supposed to be like any other Friday, busy, loud, and exhausting, but something was wrong. The restaurant, usually buzzing with a sophisticated energy because of the live music, felt jagged and raw. It was past 8 o'clock, the time when the pianist usually arrived to smooth out the edges of the dining experience with soft jazz or classical melodies. But the bench was empty. The shiny black lid was closed. The corner of the room felt like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. The manager was pacing behind the counter, checking his wristwatch every 30 seconds. He looked like a man about to explode. He kept glancing at the front door, as if his stare alone could make the musician appear, but the street outside only offered a view of rain-slicked pavement and passing cars. Finally, he grabbed the house phone behind the bar, his face turning a shade of pale white that had nothing to do with the restaurant's lighting. When he hung up, he slammed the receiver down a little too hard, causing the ice in the nearby bin to rattle. He walked over to the waitstaff station, rubbing his temples. "He isn't coming," he muttered, his voice tight with stress. "Car accident. He's okay, but he's not coming tonight." She felt a drop of disappointment land in her stomach, heavy and cold. Even though she never let herself listen too closely because it hurt too much to hear someone else playing the instrument she loved, the background music made the shift bearable. It masked the clattering dishes, the loud chewing, and the demands of the customers. Without it, the restaurant was just a noisy hall. But there was nothing she could do. She picked up her pitcher of water and a heavy tray of dirty dishes, forcing herself back into the grind. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the room grew worse. Without the soft piano to fill the gaps, the conversation seemed louder, more aggressive. People drank more to fill the silence. A large group of businessmen in the center section had been there for 3 hours and were getting increasingly rowdy. Their ties were loosened, their faces flushed, and their laughter was barking and sharp. They were the kind of customers who treated the staff like furniture, snapping fingers and shouting orders without making eye contact. She was clearing a table near the back, her arms aching, when she noticed the commotion starting near the piano. One of the businessmen, a man with a red face and a rumpled shirt, had stumbled away from his table. He was swaying slightly, holding a half-full glass of wine like a weapon. He weaved through the chairs, heading straight for the silent instrument in the corner. Most of the staff just watched, rolling their eyes. They were used to drunk people doing stupid things. But she froze. She watched him walk up to the baby grand and lean heavily against it, spilling a splash of red wine onto the pristine floor. He laughed at his own clumsiness, then reached out a heavy hand and grabbed the keyboard lid. With a loud thud, he yanked it open. "Hey!" the manager shouted from across the room, starting to march over. "Sir, you can't touch that." The drunk man ignored him. He looked at the keys with a goofy, unfocused grin. Then, he lifted both hands and brought them down hard. Crash. It wasn't music. It was just noise. A discordant, jangling slam of notes that rang out through the restaurant like a scream. He laughed again and did it again, banging his fists on the ivory, treating a priceless instrument like a toy drum. The sound was physically painful to her ears. It was an insult. It felt like watching someone scribble on a masterpiece painting with a permanent marker. The room went quiet for a second, shocked by the noise, but then the drunk man's friends started cheering him on, encouraging the vandalism. "Play us a song, Mike," one of them yelled. "Come on, maestro." Another shouted. She didn't think. She didn't plan it. One moment she was standing by the dirty dish bin, and the next she was moving across the room. She didn't care about the table she was supposed to be clearing or the water pitcher she left behind. She didn't care that she was just a waitress and he was a customer spending a lot of money. She couldn't stand there and listen to the piano being tortured. It felt too personal. It felt like he was mocking her past, her dreams, and everything she had given up. She reached the piano just as the manager arrived. The manager was sputtering, trying to find the right words to de-escalate the situation without losing a big customer, but she stepped right between them. She didn't push the man. She didn't yell at him. She simply stepped into his space, her presence sudden and firm. The smell of alcohol coming off him was strong, but she didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye, her expression dead serious. The man blinked, startled by her sudden appearance. He took a step back, his hands raising in a mock surrender, the grin fading from his face. "Whoa, okay, take it easy," he mumbled, realizing the staff wasn't just going to laugh it off. He turned and stumbled back to his table, leaving the piano lid open and the silence hanging in the air. The manager let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a minute. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "I'll get him cut off." He started to walk away, expecting her to go back to work. But she didn't move. She was standing right in front of the bench. The piano was right there. The keys were exposed. The silence that followed the man's banging was heavy, waiting to be filled. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, harder than it had when she was running food. A voice in her head was screaming at her to walk away, to go back to the safety of the kitchen, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She looked down at her hands. They were rough and red from the hot dish water, fingernails clipped short for hygiene. These hands carried trays, scrubbed counters, and counted tips. They weren't the delicate, manicured hands of a concert pianist anymore. But underneath the calluses, the muscle memory was still there. It was dormant, sleeping, waiting to be woken up. Without making a conscious decision to sit, her body just gave in to the pull. She turned and lowered herself onto the bench. It felt surreal. The fabric of her work pants felt scratchy against the wood, a sharp contrast to the elegance of the instrument. She was still wearing her dirty apron, still had her ordering book in her pocket. She looked ridiculous, a tired waitress in the middle of a chaotic shift, sitting at a grand piano. The manager stopped walking away. He turned back, looking at her with confusion. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low. "We don't have time for jokes." She didn't answer him. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, and her mouth was dry. She was terrified. Her hands hovered over the keys, shaking slightly. She felt like an imposter. What was she thinking? She hadn't played seriously in years. She was going to embarrass herself. She was going to make a fool of herself in front of 100 people. Just one chord, she told herself. Just play one chord to fix the sound he made. To show the piano respect. Then get up. She took a deep, shaky breath and placed her right thumb on a C note. Then, she pressed down. The sound was clear and pure, cutting through the stale air of the restaurant. It was a simple, singular note, but it rang out with a resonance that made her vibrate. It wasn't a bang, it was a caress. For a split second, the memory of the drunk man's violence was erased, replaced by purity. She didn't stand up. Her fingers found the next note, and then the next. It wasn't a song yet, just a scale, warming up, feeling the resistance of the keys. But the sensation was electric. It felt like waking up a limb that had fallen asleep. The tingling shot up her arm and spread through her chest. The anxiety, the exhaustion, the smell of the fried food, it all faded into the background. The world shrank down until it was just her and the vibration of the strings. She heard a few murmurs from the tables nearby. People were noticing. They were pointing. The manager was standing there with his mouth open. But she closed her eyes. If she looked at them, she would lose her nerve. She had to pretend she was back in her bedroom, alone, safe. She had to pretend she was just a girl with a dream again. She began to play a melody she hadn't played in years, a complex, swirling piece that started slow and sad. Her left hand found the bass line, steady and grounding, while her right hand began to dance. The stiffness in her fingers began to melt away, replaced by a fluidity that shocked her. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The notes began to flow, not perfectly at first, but with a growing confidence. She poured her frustration into the keys, the heavy, low chords expressing the tiredness of her week. Then, the melody climbed higher, lighter, searching for hope. It was a conversation without words, a raw and unfiltered expression of everything she had been holding back for 10 years. She wasn't serving tables anymore. She wasn't invisible. For the first time in a long time, she was being heard. And she wasn't about to stop. The moment her fingers truly connected with the ivory, the world around her began to dissolve. At first, she was still aware of the sticky floor beneath her shoes and the smell of fried onions drifting from the kitchen. But as the melody started to weave itself together, those physical things began to fade, pushed into the background by a wave of sound that felt more real to her than anything she had touched in years. She wasn't reading music. There was no sheet music on the rack, and even if there had been, she wouldn't have needed it. She was playing from a place deep inside her chest, a reservoir of emotion she had capped off tightly like a shaken bottle of soda. For 10 years, she had swallowed her frustration, her exhaustion, and her grief, packing it down so she could keep moving, keep working, keep surviving. Now, that pressure was finding an escape route through her fingertips. The sound started softly, a gentle, morning tune that seemed to apologize for the harsh noise that had filled the room moments before. It was a classical piece, but she wasn't playing it exactly the way it was written. She was slowing it down, dragging the notes out until they ached. It sounded like a goodbye. Her left hand kept a steady, heartbeat rhythm in the lower registers, a deep and resonant thrumming that you could feel in your own chest, while her right hand began to explore the higher notes, delicate and hesitant, like a stepmother testing ice on a winter pond. Then, something shifted. The hesitation vanished. Her hands, which had been stiff and cold just seconds ago, began to warm up. The blood flowing through her veins seemed to ignite, rushing to her fingertips with a frantic energy. The music picked up the pace. The slow, sad melody twisted suddenly, spiraling upward into something faster, sharper, and filled with a jagged kind of energy. To the people sitting at the nearest tables, the transformation was shocking. They watched a tired woman in a dirty uniform disappear, replaced by someone else entirely. Her posture changed. She sat up straighter, her shoulders rolling back, her head lifting slightly as if she were listening to a voice only she could hear. The tiredness in her face smoothed out, replaced by a fierce intensity. Her eyes were still closed, but her eyebrows were knit together in concentration. She wasn't thinking about which key came next, she was letting the music pour through her, guiding her hands faster and faster. She began to improvise, blending the rigid structure of the classical music she learned in school with the raw, messy soul of the blues she had heard on the radio during her long drives home. The contrast was electrifying. One moment, the piano was singing a sweet, innocent lullaby, and the next, it crashed down into a thunderous, stormy rhythm that made the silverware on the tables vibrate. She wasn't holding back anymore. She struck the keys with a force that surprised her. Years of lifting heavy trays and scrubbing pots had given her a physical strength she didn't have as a teenager. She used that strength now, digging into the piano, demanding every ounce of sound it could give. The instrument, which had sat silent and neglected for so long, seemed to wake up under her touch. The sound swelled, filling the high ceilings of the restaurant, bouncing off the walls, and wrapping around the diners. It was impossible to ignore. A group of young women at a table near the window stopped talking about their dates. They turned their chairs around, facing the piano. The cell phones, usually held up to take pictures of food or record-drunk friends, were now being pointed at her. But she didn't notice. A waiter froze halfway to the kitchen, a tray of drinks balanced precariously in his hand. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open, staring at the woman he had worked side by side with for months, never knowing this was hiding inside her. Even the noisy businessmen in the center of the room went quiet. The man who had been banging on the piano earlier looked confused, his drunkenness fading as he tried to process what he was hearing. He looked at his friends, then back at her, his face flushing with embarrassment. He realized, in that moment, that he had made a fool of himself. He had treated a Ferrari like a tricycle. The woman he had ignored was painting a masterpiece with sound while he sat there with spilled wine on his shirt. The music was telling a story. It wasn't just a random collection of notes. It had a narrative arc, a beginning, a middle, and a climax. It spoke of hard work and of hands that hurt at the end of the day. It spoke of invisible dreams and the quiet desperation of a life put on hold. But then, the melody began to climb again, rising out of the darkness. It became defiant, strong, and incredibly fast. Her hands were a blur now, moving across the keyboard with a speed that defied logic. The notes cascaded down like a waterfall, clear and bright, washing away the heaviness in the room. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, a lightness. It was as if the heavy weight of the apron she wore, the weight of the bills, the weight of the expectations, had all been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't defined by what she did for other people. She wasn't defined by her job title or her bank account. In this moment, she was pure energy, pure talent, pure soul. She was free. The complexity of the piece was growing. She was weaving in layers of sound, creating a texture so thick that you felt like you could reach out and touch it. She would play a quiet, intricate melody with her right hand while her left hand pounded out a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat racing with fear and excitement. Then, she would cross her hands, her left hand reaching up to the high notes while her right hand dove down into the bass, creating a sound that was unpredictable and wild. The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just silence, it was a held breath. The entire restaurant was holding its breath with her. People were leaning forward, elbows on tables, unconsciously drawn closer to the source of the sound. They weren't just customers anymore, they were an audience. And for the first time that night, the atmosphere in the room wasn't chaotic or greedy. It was united. Everyone, from the busboys to the wealthy diners, was connected by that single instrument. She approached the climax of the song. The music became loud, aggressive, and almost violent in its passion. Her fingers slammed down on the chords, sending a shockwave through the floor. She was sweating now, a bead of perspiration rolling down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. Her hair was falling out of its tight ponytail, sticking to her neck, but she didn't care. She was pounding the keys, venting every ounce of anger she had ever felt about the unfairness of life. It was a scream of triumph turned into music. And then, as suddenly as it had exploded, the intensity pulled back. The loud chords stopped. Her hands moved to the very top of the keyboard, playing notes so high and soft they sounded like wind chimes or a distant memory. It was a whisper compared to the roar of the previous moment. The contrast was heartbreakingly beautiful. She gently caressed the keys, playing a slow, descending melody that sounded like tears drying on a cheek. She was bringing the energy back down, grounding it, settling it. She was dimming the lights of the song. The notes became slower, further apart. She held onto the final chord, letting it ring out, feeling the vibration dying away slowly under her fingertips. She kept her hands hovering over the keys for a long moment after the sound had faded into nothingness, her eyes still closed, not quite ready to let the magic go and return to the real world. Her chest was heaving, as if she had just run a marathon. She felt drained, but in a good way, a way she hadn't felt in years. She sat there for a few seconds more, suspended in the silence she had created. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the empty silence before she started, it was a full silence, a heavy silence that was packed with the emotions of everyone in the room. She knew, without looking, that she wasn't invisible anymore. The very last note seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against the high ceiling long after her fingers had pulled away. It was a soft, fragile sound, like a whisper, and as it faded into silence, the restaurant felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an electricity that made the hair on people's arms stand up. For maybe 5 seconds, nobody moved. It was a complete, absolute silence, the kind that rarely happens in a crowded room full of people. Even the kitchen staff, usually audible through the swinging doors, had gone quiet. She sat there, her hands hovering just above the keys, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her eyes were still closed. She was terrified to open them. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she was still back in her conservatory, safe and admired. She knew that the moment she opened her eyes, the spell would break. She would just be a waitress again, out of breath and out of place. She felt a hot rush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. What had she been thinking? She had abandoned her tables. She had made a scene. She had probably broken a dozen company rules by touching the expensive instrument. Slowly, she pulled her hands back into her lap and blinked. The golden light from the lamp stung her eyes. As her vision cleared, she saw a wall of faces staring at her. The table of businessmen wasn't laughing anymore. The red-faced man who had banged on the piano earlier was staring at her with his mouth slightly open, his glass of wine forgotten in his hand. He looked like a child who had just been scolded, but softer, shaken awake. The young women by the window had their hands over their mouths. Her fellow servers were standing frozen in the middle of the room, trays held loosely at their sides. She felt small under their gaze. The power she had felt while playing evaporated, replaced by a crushing wave of self-consciousness. She looked down at her lap. She was still wearing her stained black apron. Her name tag was slightly crooked. She felt ridiculous, like a child playing dress up in her mother's clothes. A single person started clapping. It was an older man in the corner, a regular who usually sat reading his newspaper and ignored everyone. He brought his hands together slowly, deliberately. Then, a waiter joined in. Then, the table by the window. Suddenly, the silence shattered. The room erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. People started standing up. The businessmen were on their feet, clapping and shouting bravo. The noise was overwhelming, a wave of sound crashing over her. It was so loud that she instinctively shrank back, pulling her shoulders up to her ears. She didn't know how to handle it. Performers live for applause, but she wasn't a performer anymore. She was a server who had just lost control. The applause didn't make her feel proud, it made her feel exposed. She felt a spike of panic. She needed to get away. She needed to hide. She stood up quickly, the bench scraping loudly against the floor. She gave the crowd a terrified, awkward little nod, not a bow, but a flinch, and then she turned and fled. She practically ran toward the kitchen, pushing past a busboy who was trying to get closer. She didn't look at the manager. She didn't look at the customers. She just needed the safety of the back hallway. But while she ran away from the attention, something else was happening in the dining room. A young woman sitting at a table near the piano had been recording the whole thing on her phone. She had started recording when the drunk man began banging on the keys, intending to catch a funny video of a Friday night fail to share with her friends. But when the waitress sat down, she had kept recording. The video was grainy and vertical, but the audio was crystal clear. It captured the perfect contrast, the noisy, messy restaurant in the beginning, the disrespectful drunk man, and then the sudden silence when the waitress sat down. The camera zoomed in slightly, focusing on her hands, chipped nail polish, rough skin, and then panned up to her face. You could see the transformation happen in real time. You could see the exhaustion vanish, replaced by fierce concentration. Then, the audio picked up the music, swelling and filling the room. The young woman looked at her phone, her heart racing a little. She knew she had caught something special. It wasn't just a video of someone playing the piano, it was a story. It was a moment of magic in a mundane place. With shaky fingers, she typed out a caption, "The waitress at my restaurant just silenced the room. I've never seen anything like this." She hit post, added the location tag, and set her phone down to finish her meal. By the time she woke up the next morning, the world had already changed, even though she didn't know it yet. She woke up in her small apartment, the morning light filtering through the thin blinds. Her head was pounding slightly. She wasn't used to the adrenaline rush of the night before, and her fingers felt stiff. For a few wonderful seconds, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought it had all been a dream. It felt too vivid, too strange to be real. But then she flexed her hands and felt the soreness in her forearms, the specific kind of ache that comes from pressing hard on piano keys for a long time. It hadn't been a dream. She had actually done it. A cold knot of anxiety formed in her stomach as she got out of bed and started getting ready for her shift. She was sure she was going to be fired. The manager was strict about staying in character, about not bothering the customers. Sure, they had clapped last night, but today was a new day. Business owners cared about rules, not magic. She envisioned walking into the restaurant and being handed her final paycheck. She wondered if she would even be able to pay rent next month. She put on her uniform with heavy hands, brushing her hair back into her usual tight ponytail. She looked in the mirror. The concert pianist was gone. The tired waitress stared back. The walk to the restaurant felt like walking to the gallows. The streets were busy, but she didn't notice anyone staring at her. She kept her head down, clutching her bag, mentally rehearsing what she would say to the manager. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." I don't know what came over me. When she turned the corner onto the street where the restaurant was located, she noticed something was wrong immediately. It was 11 o'clock in the morning, usually a quiet time before the lunch prep began. But there was a crowd outside. A small group of people was standing near the entrance, looking at the window, taking pictures. Some of them were holding phones up, filming the front door. She paused, confused. Had something happened? Was there a fire? Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to slip past the group unnoticed, keeping her head down, but just as she reached for the door handle, a young man turned and looked at her. His eyes went wide. "Hey!" he shouted. "That's her. That's the girl from the video." She froze. Her hand gripped the door handle so tight her knuckles turned white. The video. She pushed the door open and ducked inside, her heart racing. The restaurant was chaotic, but not in the usual way. The phones at the front desk were ringing off the hook, both lines lit up, flashing red. The manager was standing behind the counter, looking harried, answering one phone while typing furiously on a computer. There were post-it notes stuck all over the monitor. He looked up as she walked in, still wearing her coat, looking terrified. He hung up the phone abruptly. "You're here," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It sounded breathless. "I'm so sorry about last night," she rushed out, the words tumbling over each other. "I know I wasn't supposed to touch the piano. I know I abandoned my tables. I won't do it again. Please don't fire me." The manager stared at her for a moment. Then, a strange smile spread across his face. He walked around the counter and grabbed her gently by the shoulders, turning her toward a tablet computer sitting on the host stand. The screen was open to a video page. "For you," he laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "Look." She looked at the screen. The video was right there. It had already been viewed 2 million times. The title read, "Waitress Serenades Restaurant, Leaves Crowd in Tears." She watched the small screen, seeing herself sit down, seeing the transformation. She scrolled down. The comments were flooding in faster than she could read them. "Who is this? She has to be famous. I cried watching this. The emotion in her hands is unreal. Why is she serving tables? Sign her to a record label immediately." The look on her face at the end. "I felt that." The manager tapped the screen. "I've had 20 calls from news stations already. 3 different talent agencies have emailed us this morning asking for your contact information. We have a line out the door of people wanting to book a table for tonight just in case you play again." She stood there, her mouth open, unable to process the numbers. 2 million views. 2 million people had seen her secret. They had seen her pain and her joy. They hadn't seen a waitress, they had seen an artist. The manager shook his head, still looking at the comments. "I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. You can't fire yourself, kid. You're the best thing that ever happened to this place." She felt a tremor run through her body. It wasn't the fear of being fired anymore. It was the terrifying, thrilling realization that her life, the small, safe, invisible life she had built for herself, had just been completely blown open. The secret was out. There was no going back into the shadows. The world was watching, and they were waiting for the next song. The days that followed the video going viral were a complete blur, a whirlwind of noise and confusion that made her quiet life feel like a distant memory. Her phone, which used to stay silent for days except for work schedules, suddenly wouldn't stop buzzing. It beeped and rang constantly with notifications, emails, and messages from numbers she didn't recognize. At first, it was exciting, a rush of adrenaline to see that millions of people had seen her face and heard her music. But as the hours turned into days, the excitement turned into a heavy, suffocating pressure. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the screen. There were messages from record labels, television producers, and talent agents. They all used big, flashy words like opportunity, stardom, and career-defining. They wanted to meet her immediately. They wanted to sign contracts. They wanted to own a piece of the magic she had shown that night in the restaurant. But looking at their polished emails and slick websites, she felt a knot of cold fear in her stomach. They didn't know her. They didn't know that she was a waitress who lived paycheck to paycheck. They just saw a viral video, a product they could sell. They saw a story, not a person. She turned the phone face down on the table and closed her eyes. The silence in her apartment was loud. For years, she had dreamed of being discovered. She had imagined a fairy tale where a famous conductor would walk into the restaurant, hear her playing, and whisk her away to a concert hall. Now that the world had actually found her, it didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt scary. It felt like she was losing control. She remembered why she had stopped playing in the first place: the pressure, the expectations, the fear of not being good enough. It was all coming back. A few days later, she walked into the restaurant for her shift. It was a Tuesday, usually a slow night, but the place was buzzing. Every table was booked. There were even people standing at the bar, just waiting to catch a glimpse of her. As she walked through the dining room, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. People whispered and pointed. It made her skin crawl. She felt like an animal in a zoo. She put on her apron and tied it tight around her waist, trying to create a barrier between herself and the stares. But the manager called her into the office before she could pick up her first order. He looked stressed, rubbing his chin, but his eyes were shining. "We have a problem," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Or maybe an opportunity. People aren't coming here for the pasta anymore. They are coming for you. I have reporters calling asking if they can interview the mystery pianist. I have a promoter in Las Vegas offering to fly you out this weekend to talk." She stood in the middle of the small office, feeling the weight of his expectations. "I just want to do my job," she said quietly. "I don't want to be a show pony." The manager sighed. "You are too talented to be just a waitress. You know that, and I know that. But this is moving fast. If you sign with these big guys, they might chew you up. You need to be smart." He stood up and walked over to a whiteboard on the wall. "Here is my offer. Keep playing here. Friday and Saturday nights. We pay you as a musician, not a server. You wear what you want. You play what you want. No contracts with strangers yet. Let's do this on your terms. Get your feet wet." She looked at him, surprised. It wasn't $1 million deal, but it was safe. It was familiar. It was a stage where she didn't have to be afraid. "And I don't have to serve drinks while I play?" she asked. The manager laughed. "No drinks. Just music." The next few weeks were a period of intense practice and transformation. She moved the dusty keyboard from the corner of her apartment to the center of the room. She stopped looking at the comments on the internet, ignoring both the praise and the hate, and focused entirely on the keys. She realized that if she was going to stand on a stage again, She couldn't just play the old classics she learned in school. She had to play her own story. She started to write, letting her fingers wander until they found melodies that expressed the last 10 years of her life, the struggle, the pain, but also the quiet hope that never really went away. Finally, the night arrived. It was exactly 1 month after the video had changed everything. The restaurant was different tonight. There were no white tablecloths or candles. The manager had rearranged the room. The tables were pushed back to the walls, leaving a large, open space in the center. Chairs were set up in rows, facing the grand piano. It looked less like a dining hall and more like a jazz club. There was a tension in the air, a buzz of anticipation. The crowd was a mix of her regulars, curious foodies, and people who had traveled from out of town just to see if the video was real. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress that she had found at a thrift store and saved for years, never having a reason to wear it until now. Her hair was down, falling loosely around her shoulders. She took a deep breath, wiping her sweaty palms on her dress. "You ready?" a co-worker whispered, giving her a gentle nudge. She nodded, even though she felt like she might throw up. She stepped out of the kitchen and into the light. The reaction was immediate. A wave of applause rippled through the room, louder and warmer than she expected. People stood up. They clapped not just because she was famous, but because they were rooting for her. They knew the story. They knew she was one of them, a worker, a human being who had struggled in the shadows. She walked to the piano, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. Sitting down on the bench felt different this time. She wasn't sneaking a moment of joy between shifts. She belonged there. The light hit her face, warm and bright, and for the first time, she didn't want to hide. She didn't start with a bang. She placed her hands on the keys and played a soft, hesitant chord. The room went silent instantly. She closed her eyes and let the music take over. She started with the song she had played that first night, the one that had started it all, but she changed it. It wasn't sad anymore. It was strong. Her fingers moved with a confidence she hadn't felt in a decade. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She was thinking about the late nights, the sore feet, and the feeling of being invisible. She poured all of that into the music, turning her pain into something beautiful that the audience could feel. She saw people in the front row wiping tears from their eyes. She saw the cynical businessmen from weeks ago, sitting in the back with their arms crossed, looking completely mesmerized. As she played, she felt the heavy chains of the past 10 years breaking, link by link. The fear of failure, the shame of being a waitress, the regret of lost time, it all dissolved into the sound. She wasn't serving anyone anymore. She wasn't asking for permission to exist. She was giving a gift, and the gift was being received with love. She transitioned into a new piece, one she had written herself. It was fast, joyful, and full of life. It sounded like a bird taking flight for the first time. Her hands danced across the keys, flashing in the spotlight. She was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She felt lighter than air, floating on the melody. When she hit the final chord, she held it, letting it ring out into the rafters. She opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd. They were on their feet before the sound even faded. The roar was deafening, a wall of sound that washed over her and pushed away the last of her doubts. She stood up and took a bow. She didn't run away this time. She stood tall, center stage, and accepted the applause. She saw her manager standing in the back, giving her a thumbs up. She saw the dishwasher and the busboys cheering the loudest. She wasn't a mystery anymore, and she wasn't a waitress hiding a secret. She was a musician. She was home. The journey from the shadows to the spotlight was complete, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was just the beginning of her song.